The tension in the grand military chamber was thick, the kind that pressed down on everyone's chest and demanded silence, yet all eyes were fixed on the young woman who stood near the polished oak table, her hands clenched at her sides, her gaze steady despite the array of decorated officers who sat in judgment before her. She had spoken with unwavering conviction only moments earlier, presenting an idea so bold, so unlike anything they had dared to attempt, that the colonel at the head of the room had let out a sharp scoff, a sound that cut through the air and drew uncomfortable glances from the other men and women seated around him, and his lips curled with disdain as he leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he told her that this was no place for childish fantasies and that wars were not won with the naive hopes of inexperienced dreamers. His words carried the weight of years spent in command, his chest heavy with medals, his face marked by the hard lines of battles fought and survived, but she did not flinch, and in that moment something stirred among those who had at first dismissed her as insignificant. She began to speak again, her voice calmer this time, yet sharper, describing in precise detail a plan that none of them had dared to imagine, a maneuver that would turn the enemy's strength against itself, and as she unfolded each step of her strategy, the silence in the room deepened, the dismissive sneers fading into frowns of concentration, the skeptical eyes narrowing not in mockery but in reluctant respect. The colonel tried to interrupt, his tone harsh as if to reassert dominance, but she countered smoothly, her words steady, her knowledge evident in the way she outlined troop movements, resource allocations, and timing with a precision that betrayed neither hesitation nor doubt. Each sentence landed like a blow, reshaping the atmosphere, until even the most stubborn officers leaned forward slightly, compelled by the realization that she was not speaking in abstractions but with the clarity of someone who had studied every angle, who had lived through the consequences in her mind 1,000 times before stepping into this very room. Her eyes, dark and unyielding, swept across the faces of those gathered, and she told them of the intelligence reports that had been ignored, of patterns in enemy movements that none had noticed, of weaknesses that had been left unexploited because no one had dared to think differently, and her words painted a vision not of reckless risk but of calculated inevitability, and slowly the murmur of doubt that had rippled beneath the colonel's scoff began to dissolve into something else, something that unsettled even him, belief. A shift occurred then, almost imperceptible at first, as the general seated at the far end of the table tilted his head, his weathered hands folding together, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the truth in her reasoning, and he asked her a single question, quiet but firm, testing her resolve. Without hesitation she answered, her response carrying not only the logic of her plan but the conviction of someone who understood the stakes more deeply than any of them, because unlike the men in their uniforms of power and command, she had seen the cost of failure firsthand, she had walked through the ruins left behind by indecision and arrogance, she had held the hands of the fallen when orders had come too late. That truth vibrated in her voice, and though she never raised it to a shout, it carried more power than the colonel's scoff ever could. The silence that followed her final words stretched long, heavy, filled with the sound of shifting breaths and beating hearts, and though the colonel sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tight as though carved from stone, he could not mask the flicker of unease in his eyes when he realized that the room no longer looked at him for certainty, that their gazes had turned to her, the outsider, the one he had mocked, and in that moment the balance of authority shifted, quiet but undeniable, leaving everyone present stunned by the transformation they had just witnessed, a transformation so profound that none of them could have believed it possible until it unfolded before their eyes. The colonel's lips pressed into a thin line, and though he forced himself to sit tall, his fingers drummed against the table as if betraying the storm of thought running beneath his hardened expression. Yet he refused to yield, for yielding meant admitting he had been wrong to scoff, wrong to dismiss her as irrelevant, and wrong to believe that authority alone commanded respect. He cleared his throat with deliberate weight, his voice booming through the chamber as he questioned her sources, attempting to undermine her credibility, but she met his gaze without flinching, her answer carrying both precision and memory, for she recited dates, numbers, intercepted transmissions, even the subtle inconsistencies in the enemy's tactics that she had pieced together like shards of glass forming a dangerous mosaic, and her voice gained momentum with each revelation, like a rising tide against a crumbling wall. Some officers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable now not with her boldness but with the realization that they had overlooked truths lying plainly in the reports they had dismissed, and though the colonel tried to lace his tone with contempt, his interruptions faltered, for every challenge he threw was met with an answer sharper than the last, until his words became echoes of desperation rather than confidence. The woman, whose name many of them had scarcely bothered to remember when the meeting began, had transformed into the axis around which the entire conversation now turned, and her calm defiance began to inspire not only reluctant acknowledgement but a spark of hope in those who had grown weary of defeat after defeat. Her voice carried stories of scouts lost because warnings were ignored, of villages burned because defenses had been miscalculated, of comrades left to die because pride had outweighed caution, and though her recounting was not emotional in tone, the weight of it pressed heavily on the room, because they all knew in their hearts that her words were true, and it was truth that silenced the last smirk from the colonel's face. The general leaned forward then, speaking quietly yet firmly, asking her to explain how she intended to implement the plan she had proposed, and she did so with a clarity that made the room feel smaller, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen, each detail unfolding in sequence, every contingency accounted for, every risk paired with a countermeasure, and in the sharpness of her explanation, there was no hesitation, no stumble, only the quiet confidence of someone who had not only imagined the battle but lived it in her mind so many times that it was as real to her as the breath she drew. A younger officer near the end of the table, one who had earlier followed the colonel's example and scoffed under his breath, now found himself nodding unconsciously, his hand moving across paper to sketch the maneuvers she described, and the realization that the enemy's great strength could indeed be turned into their undoing spread like a current through the chamber. The colonel, seeing his hold on the room slipping, leaned back with a scoff heavier than before, claiming that theory and reality were not the same, that battles were not fought on paper but in blood, but before his words could dominate the silence, she replied that she knew that truth better than anyone here, that she had seen blood spill, that she had carried wounded bodies through mud and fire when others hid behind strategy maps, and her tone, though steady, cut deeper than any shout could have, forcing the colonel into silence for the first time since the meeting began. Eyes darted around the room, the officers caught between habit and awakening, between the authority of rank and the undeniable clarity of vision, and though no one dared speak it aloud, the question lingered in the air: who, in this moment, truly commanded them? The general's silence stretched long, but in his stillness there was calculation, a weighing of scales between tradition and necessity, and though his decision was not yet spoken, the colonel's jaw tightened further because he felt it too. The tide had shifted, and it was no longer in his favor. The woman could sense the shift in the atmosphere though she did not allow herself to savor it, for she knew the battle was not yet won, not on the fields beyond their borders and not within this very room where doubt still lurked like a shadow ready to choke the light of her words, and so she pressed forward, her voice unwavering, painting for them the exact sequence of events that would unfold if they clung to their old methods, a sequence drenched in defeat, unnecessary deaths, and the slow erosion of the morale they desperately needed to preserve, and as she spoke she made them feel the weight of that future, not as a distant threat but as an inevitability if they refused to act. She told them of the scouts already reporting strange enemy regrouping near the northern ridge, of the hidden supply lines they thought secure but which were already under quiet observation, of the patterns of enemy rotations that suggested a trap designed to bleed them dry, and as each revelation dropped into the room, officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in old strategies withering with every word she delivered. The colonel's face darkened, his hand curling into a fist against the table, but he did not interrupt now, for he sensed that interruption only gave her more power, and though he glared at her with the kind of rage that came not only from disagreement but from the humiliation of losing control, he could not deny that the room no longer belonged to him. She did not stop, not even when the weight of silence pressed against her chest, for she knew if she faltered now, if her resolve wavered even slightly, the colonel would seize it as proof of weakness, and so she steadied herself with the memory of why she was here, of the families who had begged for someone to speak the truth, of the soldiers who had whispered their doubts but dared not voice them aloud. Every syllable she spoke carried their unspoken cries, and though her voice remained level, beneath it lay the strength of hundreds who could not be present. At last, she came to the heart of her plan, the maneuver so bold that it seemed madness until one listened closely, until the layers of calculation revealed themselves like hidden gears in a machine, and she described how a feigned retreat would draw the enemy into overextension, how supply lines carefully severed would starve their advance, how terrain long considered disadvantageous could be turned into a trap that would crush them under the weight of their own arrogance, and when she finished laying out the final stroke, a hush heavier than any before fell upon the chamber. The general's eyes were fixed on her, sharp and unblinking, but behind them stirred something unspoken, a recognition that perhaps the future of this war had just shifted in the span of a single conversation, and though his lips did not yet move, the stillness of his body carried more weight than any words. An older officer who had remained silent throughout the meeting finally spoke, his voice raspy with age yet firm with experience, and he admitted that in all his years of service he had never heard a plan that balanced risk and reward with such clarity, and his statement rippled through the room like a stone thrown into still water, for it confirmed what many already felt but dared not voice. The colonel bristled, his pride straining against the tide, and with a sneer he declared that this was nothing more than the desperate gambit of someone who had nothing to lose, but she met his accusation with calm, her reply steady as she told him that he was wrong, that she had everything to lose, more than anyone in this room, because unlike them she did not fight for medals or reputation but for the people whose lives hung in the balance of their decisions, and her words landed like a blade, cutting through pretense, leaving the colonel exposed in a way he had never been before. The silence that followed was no longer born of doubt but of realization, for every officer present understood that the strength of her conviction did not come from ambition but from truth, and though the colonel tried to mask his shaken composure, it was clear to all that his authority had cracked, perhaps irreparably, and in that fracture the possibility of a new path began to take root. The general finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and though his expression remained unreadable, the weight of his gaze lingered on the young woman longer than on anyone else in the room, as if he were measuring not only the logic of her strategy but the fire within her spirit, the kind of fire that could inspire soldiers to fight beyond their limits. And when he at last spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, each one carrying the authority of decades of command, as he asked her not whether her plan could succeed but whether she had the strength to lead those who would carry it out. And though the colonel immediately stiffened at such a suggestion, his protest forming like thunder on his tongue, she answered before he could, her voice unshaken as she declared that she would lead if given the chance, that she would not hide behind maps and walls while others bled for choices made in comfort, and the conviction in her tone rippled through the room, igniting something in the hearts of those listening. The colonel erupted then, his hands slamming against the table with a crack that echoed off the chamber walls, his voice rising in furious protest as he accused her of arrogance, of overstepping boundaries she could never understand, and he reminded them all of her lack of formal rank, her lack of years in uniform, her absence of medals earned in sanctioned battles, but as his words thundered, they sounded less like the iron of discipline and more like the desperate noise of a man watching his authority crumble. The young woman did not raise her voice in return, instead she let his fury fill the air until it suffocated itself, and only then did she speak, her tone calm yet edged with steel, telling him that rank without wisdom was a danger, that medals won without learning were hollow, and that soldiers did not follow ribbons but truth, and the room, though silent, seemed to echo her words louder than the colonel's roar. The younger officers shifted uneasily, many of them hiding the sparks of agreement in their eyes, while the older veterans exchanged quiet glances, the kind that carried unspoken acknowledgement, and slowly the colonel's anger began to feel less like dominance and more like desperation. The general did not intervene, perhaps because he wished to see how the storm would play out, and in that silence the woman stepped forward, closing the distance to the table, her presence commanding without needing force, her eyes fixed on the colonel as she told him that if he truly believed her plan to be foolish, then he should allow her to test it in the field with her own life on the line, for if she failed he would be proven right, and if she succeeded, then it would mean he had been blind to the possibility of victory. The challenge struck the room like lightning, and even the colonel, hardened as he was, faltered for an instant, his mouth opening without words, his certainty fractured by the audacity of her offer. The silence that followed was suffocating, every officer holding their breath, waiting for the explosion that surely would come, but instead the colonel sat back slowly, his jaw tightening, his glare like fire boring into her, and though he said nothing, it was clear that in refusing her challenge he would appear weak, and in accepting it he risked being undone. The general's voice cut through at last, calm but commanding, and he declared that her plan would be given consideration, that a small force would be assigned under her command to test its merit, and though the colonel's fury flared again, the general's tone carried the weight of finality, leaving no room for argument. The young woman inclined her head respectfully, though her eyes gleamed with resolve, for she knew this was more than just an opportunity, it was the opening of a door that had been sealed shut by tradition and pride, a door she intended to push wide enough for all those who had been silenced before her. The officers remained in stunned quiet, their thoughts a storm of disbelief and curiosity, for none of them could have imagined, when the meeting began, that the colonel's scoff would mark the beginning of such a seismic shift in their world, and yet here they were, witnesses to a moment that none of them would ever forget. The days that followed moved with a strange, electric tension, for the decision had been made and whispers of it spread quickly through the barracks, igniting curiosity and skepticism in equal measure, and when the young woman arrived at the training grounds to meet the small detachment assigned to her, She found a group of soldiers who looked at her not with open defiance but with wary uncertainty, as though unsure whether to laugh at the absurdity of their new commander or to fear the conviction in her eyes. Yet she did not falter. She addressed them with the same unyielding calm she had shown in the chamber, telling them that she would ask no more of them than she would demand of herself, that she would bleed beside them if necessary, and though her words were simple, they carried the weight of sincerity, and sincerity was a language soldiers understood more clearly than speeches filled with pomp. The colonel, unwilling to be silenced, appeared often on the sidelines, watching with cold eyes, waiting for her to stumble, and more than once he whispered his doubts to those around him, planting seeds of distrust, but she did not allow his shadow to deter her. Instead she poured her energy into the preparation, walking the fields with her soldiers, learning their names, their strengths, their fears, and soon they began to see in her not a pretender but a leader who bore their burdens alongside them. Night after night she drilled them, refining every detail of the strategy she had presented, adjusting movements to account for terrain, supply shortages and timing, and though exhaustion weighed heavy on their bodies, they followed her because she endured the same strain without complaint, because her resolve never cracked, and because in her eyes they glimpsed something the colonel could never give them, belief in their worth. Rumors spread quickly across the base that she had discovered weaknesses in the enemy's scouting routes, that she was mapping paths through the forest ridges others had dismissed as useless, and while many scoffed at such ambition, others began to hope, for hope had long been absent in the endless grind of failed campaigns. The colonel seethed, his pride eroded each time he saw soldiers listening to her more closely than to him, yet he remained bound by the general's order, forced to watch as authority slipped further from his grasp, and the knowledge of his diminishing control fueled his anger like oil feeding a fire. When the day came for the maneuver to be tested, dawn broke heavy with mist, and the soldiers moved out under her command, their breaths clouding the air, their weapons held tighter than usual, nerves crackling through their ranks, but she walked among them with steady steps, her presence grounding them, her voice a calm thread weaving through their fear as she reminded them of the plan, of the traps they had set, of the timing that would determine their survival. They reached the ridge before sunrise, the world around them quiet save for the distant sounds of the enemy patrols, and she signaled them into position, every movement executed with precision, for weeks of training had forged them into a unit sharper than any had anticipated. The first clash came when the enemy advanced, confident in their superiority, only to find themselves funneled into narrow passes where hidden obstacles slowed them, their formation breaking under the strain, and at her command the small detachment struck swiftly, retreating as though in panic, drawing the enemy further into the snare, and though fear pounded in every soldier's chest, they trusted her voice, her timing, her vision. Hours stretched into a blur of smoke and steel, but when the sun rose high enough to burn away the mist, the trap closed exactly as she had promised. The enemy, overextended and cut off from their supplies, found themselves surrounded, their strength turned into weakness, and the soldiers under her command, though fewer in number, fought with a ferocity born of belief, until the enemy finally broke, retreating in disarray, leaving the field littered with the remnants of what was meant to be their triumph. When the dust settled, the soldiers looked around in disbelief at what they had achieved, their eyes turning to her not with uncertainty but with awe, for against all expectation she had led them not into ruin but into victory, and though the colonel, watching from a distance, clenched his fists until his knuckles bled, he could not deny what the rest of the camp would soon know. The woman he had mocked, the one he had scoffed at, had done what he could not, and the room that once laughed at her would now be forced to believe. When the soldiers returned to camp carrying both the exhaustion of battle and the spark of triumph in their eyes, the entire base shifted in mood, for word spread faster than fire through dry grass that the impossible had been done, that a plan scorned and dismissed had not only held against the enemy but had broken their advance in a way no one had managed for months, and the atmosphere that had once been heavy with despair now swelled with cautious hope. Yet that hope was sharpened by disbelief because many still struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed with what they had expected. The young woman walked at the front of her detachment, her face streaked with dirt, her body aching from the strain of the fight, but her steps never faltered, for she carried not only the weight of her own resolve but the pride of the men and women who had trusted her and found victory under her command, and when they passed through the gates the watching soldiers saluted her without orders, their instinctive respect rising above the rigid walls of rank, a gesture that caught even her by surprise though she masked it behind a steady expression. The general himself awaited their return, standing in silence as the reports were delivered, his sharp eyes missing nothing, and though he asked few questions each answer only confirmed what he already sensed, that the tide of the war had shifted in a single morning, And the source of that shift stood before him not in polished metals or crisp uniform but in the unassuming figure of the woman who had dared to speak when silence was demanded. The colonel, however, burned with a rage that no victory could cool, for every cheer, every whispered story of her brilliance, every salute not directed toward him was a dagger in his pride, and he retreated to the shadows of his quarters, pacing like a caged predator, consumed by thoughts of betrayal and humiliation, his mind twisting the truth into poison until he convinced himself that her success had been nothing more than luck, that her plan had endangered more lives than it had saved, and that the general's indulgence of her had undermined the very foundation of military order. But the soldiers did not care for his bitterness, for they had seen the battlefield with their own eyes, had lived through the trap closing around the enemy, had survived because of her guidance, and their voices carried that truth through every corner of the camp until resistance to her presence seemed not only futile but foolish. She, however, did not revel in her triumph. Instead she returned quietly to her quarters, tending to the wounded with her own hands, speaking softly to those who had doubted her yet still followed, and in her humility the soldiers found not only respect but loyalty, a loyalty that could not be bought with titles or demanded through fear. Days later, when the general convened another council, the chamber was no longer the same as before, for though the colonel sat at the head with his chest thrust forward in defiance, the officers' eyes drifted toward her whenever strategy was discussed, their questions aimed at her clarity, their trust leaning subtly toward her perspective, and though she spoke without arrogance, her words carried the weight of lived truth, making the colonel's interjections sound increasingly hollow. He could not bear it, this slow erosion of his command, and in his desperation he began to plot not merely her downfall in words but in actions, whispering to his closest confidants, stirring fear that her rise would destroy the traditions they had fought to preserve, that her methods were reckless, that the general himself had been blinded by novelty, and he swore quietly that he would find a way to expose her as the fraud he believed her to be. Yet for every whisper he planted, the soldiers answered with stories of her courage, and the more he fought against her, the more he revealed his own weakness, until the room that once had laughed with him at her expense now sat in uneasy silence at his attempts to dismiss her, their disbelief turning into suspicion, their loyalty slipping away grain by grain. The young woman, though aware of his growing hostility, refused to meet it with fear. Instead she carried on with her work, refining her strategies, training her detachment harder than ever, preparing for the inevitable next clash with the enemy, for she knew that victory was not measured in one battle but in the endurance of many, and as long as she stood, she would not allow pride or politics to steal from them the chance at survival. The colonel's resentment festered like an untreated wound, deepening with every passing day as the soldiers' whispers of admiration for her grew louder, and though he wore his uniform with the same rigid pride and barked orders with the same thunderous tone, there was an emptiness behind his authority now, an echo rather than a command, and in that emptiness his bitterness hardened into resolve, for he could no longer bear the humiliation of being overshadowed by the one he had mocked so openly. He began to meet in secret with a handful of loyalists who still clung to his rank rather than to reason, men who owed their positions to his favor and feared losing their influence if she continued to rise, and in the flickering candlelight of his quarters he whispered plans of exposing her, of pushing her into a trap that would end her streak of improbable victories, not by the enemy's hand but by the careful design of her own supposed allies. He argued that her methods, though successful once, were reckless gambles bound to fail, and he painted pictures of disaster should her influence spread unchecked, warning that she would unravel the entire structure of command and leave chaos in her wake, and though some of his followers hesitated, their doubts softened under the weight of his anger, for they had lived under his shadow too long to defy him now. Meanwhile she remained unaware of the depth of his scheming, focused instead on the growing responsibility placed upon her, for the general continued to test her with larger detachments, granting her the authority to shape not only maneuvers but morale, and each time she returned with victories, small skirmishes turned into decisive strikes, ambushes avoided, supply lines secured. The soldiers' faith in her grew until it became something unshakable, a loyalty forged in fire. Yet shadows crept closer, subtle at first, as orders reached her that seemed oddly contradictory, supply drops delayed without explanation, scouts reassigned at critical moments, maps missing key details that had once been meticulously provided, and though she suspected error, a gnawing unease stirred within her that someone was tampering with her path. Still she pressed forward, for hesitation in war was as deadly as any blade, and her soldiers trusted her to lead, their eyes searching hers for certainty in the midst of confusion, and so she gave them certainty even when doubt gnawed at her own heart. The colonel watched her march again toward the front, his lips curled in a bitter smile, for he had woven his trap carefully, ensuring she would advance into territory where the enemy had been allowed to concentrate unchecked, a place where escape seemed impossible, and he believed with smug satisfaction that when she fell, the ruin of her detachment would erase her credibility and restore his command. But what he underestimated was her instinct, that sharp edge honed not in classrooms or polished chambers but in the raw crucible of survival, for as her company moved deeper into hostile ground, she felt the patterns shift, the silence of the forest too heavy, the absence of expected patrols too precise, and though no message warned her, she sensed the trap closing long before it snapped shut. She gathered her soldiers in whispers beneath the cover of darkness, her voice steady though her heart raced, and she told them that their survival would depend on discipline, that they would not retreat blindly but turn the very jaws of the trap into their weapon, and though fear flickered in their eyes, her calm gave them strength. At dawn, when the enemy surged from the ridges with overwhelming force, expecting panic, they found instead a wall of precision. Waiting for them, every soldier under her command moving not in chaos but in orchestrated defiance, and the battle that followed burned like fire across the valley, a storm of steel and cries where every decision she made carved the line between life and death. Even as the colonel, far from the field, awaited word of her destruction, she fought with a ferocity that astonished her enemies and her allies alike, refusing to surrender, refusing to let betrayal end the lives entrusted to her, and in the crucible of that ambush the legend of her command only deepened, for though the trap had been sprung, it was the enemy, not her, who found themselves shattered by the will of those they sought to break, when the battered but unbroken detachment returned from the valley, carrying with them not defeat but another improbable victory. The camp erupted in disbelief and awe, for the soldiers had survived a storm no one thought they could endure, and the story of their stand spread like wildfire, every retelling sharpening her legend until even those who had doubted most were forced to admit that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. Yet behind the celebration a darker truth brewed, for the inconsistencies that had haunted the mission were too deliberate to ignore. The general summoned her privately, his expression stern yet not accusatory, and he asked her to recount every detail of the ambush, every absence of supplies, every deviation from orders, and as she spoke his silence grew heavier until at last he admitted that her suspicions matched his own, that sabotage from within their own ranks had nearly doomed her detachment, and though he did not name the culprit, the weight in his eyes told her he already knew. Days later the council was convened once more, the chamber filled with tension sharper than any blade, and the colonel sat stiffly at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled anger, yet his eyes restless with the fear of exposure, and when the general began to speak, detailing the evidence of falsified orders, tampered maps, and withheld supplies, a murmur swept the room like thunder before rain, and all eyes turned slowly toward the man who had once commanded their loyalty without question. The colonel leapt to his feet, his voice booming with indignation, denying every accusation, claiming he had been framed, that the woman sought to usurp his authority with lies, but his fury rang hollow now, for the soldiers who had returned from the valley bore witness to the truth, their voices steady as they confirmed the deliberate gaps in information, the unnatural silence of patrols that should have warned them, the missing supplies that nearly cost them their lives. The colonel's protests grew shrill, his composure unraveling before the eyes of those who had once revered him, and in his desperation he turned on her directly, shouting that she was nothing more than a manipulator, that her victories were flukes, that she had seduced the loyalty of the camp with promises she could never fulfill. But as he raged she stood in silence, her eyes locked on his, her calm more damning than any words, for the contrast between his crumbling authority and her unshaken resolve spoke louder than speeches ever could. At last the general rose, his voice cutting through the chaos with finality, declaring that the colonel's actions had endangered not only the mission but the very survival of their forces, and that his rank, once a shield of authority, could no longer protect him from the consequences of betrayal. And the chamber erupted in gasps as guards stepped forward at the general's command to strip him of his insignia, dragging him from the table as he roared and fought against the inevitable. In the stunned silence that followed, the general turned to her, his gaze sharp but not unkind, and he told her that leadership was not granted by rank but proven by action, and that though she had not sought power, it had sought her, and now she would bear its weight. The officers, shaken and humbled, looked at her with something beyond respect, something approaching reverence, for they had witnessed not only her brilliance in strategy but her endurance against betrayal, her refusal to break even when trapped between enemies and traitors alike, and they understood that the colonel's scoff, once a weapon of ridicule, had become the spark of a transformation none of them could have foreseen. She accepted their gaze without arrogance, her face calm though her heart beat heavy, for she knew this was not the end but the beginning of a greater burden, Yet she also knew she would carry it, not for glory or recognition, but for the soldiers who had placed their trust in her when no one else did, and as the chamber slowly emptied, leaving her alone with the weight of her new reality, she allowed herself a single quiet breath of reflection, remembering the moment when the colonel had first scoffed, and how in that moment he had believed her powerless, never realizing that his laughter would echo as the first sound of his downfall, and the first note of her rise. The end.